welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am Jessica, your host today, and I am really excited for this chat because this is one of those books that came across my feed, and everything about it, from the description to the title to the cover, was 100% something I knew I was going to love. And then, of course, I opened the book and I start reading it, and I loved it even more, which is what one hopes, right? When you're marketing, when you're like, that's what marketing teams are for.
Right.
They're supposed to make you want to read a book. And they did, and it was great. It was really, really great. It surpassed all of my expectations. Please introduce yourself and tell us about We Came to Welcome You.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Vincent Tirado. I am a horror author, non-binary, and just all around really into mysteries, thrillers, things that make you feel unsettled. We Came to Welcome You is one such book that makes you feel a little bit unsettled because it is about an interracial lesbian couple that moves into the epitome of the American dream. It's a white picket fence neighborhood. It's a gated neighborhood, so it's supposed to be very safe and just lovely. But then slowly things start to kind of reveal itself. So one half of the wives, Sol, she's going through a probation at work. She's a scientist at Yale, and she's on probation because she was accused of plagiarism, and she has to wait out all of the issues that will happen there. So she's home alone all the time, and she starts going a little stir crazy when she notices that everyone sort of talks in a very similar way. Not everyone, just like somehow finding the same ways to say things, but like it's the same tone, it's the same words. It starts getting a little creepy, in fact. She starts getting these nightmares. There are roots growing into the house, which is not something that she was advertised to, but now it makes sense because, wow, why were they able to buy this house under their budget? It's one of those things that in every horror story is like, oh, we bought a new house. Like, okay, cool. What's wrong with it? What is wrong with it? And you start to see in this book, it's not so much the house doing the haunting as it is an entire neighborhood, and all of your neighbors are in on it. So yeah, that's a quick blurb about like what happens. I sincerely hope that a lot of people enjoy this book when they read it.
It's amazing. And I will say, one of the things that's fun is I know a lot of people who are in ownership or home buying mode. And so many times the refrain is like, I just don't want to deal with an HOA. HOAs are evil. Yeah. And you definitely ran with it here.
I've never bought a home or anything, so I only know of HOAs tangentially through friends or like friends of friends and like hearing their nightmare stories. And when I was writing this book, I was like, am I like hitting it on the head a little bit too hard? Am I like, and then every time someone read is like, oh man, this is exactly what it's like. And I'm just like, I was insane when I wrote this HOA. What do you mean this is how it is? It's very funny when I think my biggest fear as an author is this, oh, I'm doing this too much. Like maybe I should scale it back. And everyone else around me is egging me on. They're like, no, you can go further with this. We can go further. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I'm not as up to date on HOA nonsense as I thought I was.
This book touches on so many different subsections of horror. We have suburban horror, social horror, queer horror, women's horror. I mean, really, it's just every single facet of it. There's other things too, and I don't want to say anything because I really just don't want to spoil the stuff that happens, and it's bonkers in the best way possible because I just literally ate it up like that pie on the cover.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is good. I just want to chat a little bit, I suppose, about the main characters. So you have Alice and you have Sol. And Alice is from a Korean family. Sol is Dominican, Afro-Latin. And obviously they're coming from different places, but they've been together quite a while. They met in college. And Alice's family still lives in Korea. Sol has a more physical relationship, not physical as in like physical, but physical as in what is left of her family, which is just her dad, he's very close by, but there is an estrangement there.
Right.
And that is just kind of a very, I think, just in general, families are just so messy. Where did the two of them come from? Did the story and did Mainless Grove come first, or did Alice and Sol walk into the book and sort of decide to live there?
Honestly, the HOA was what came first. When I was writing the story, I was like, I want to write a story about an evil HOA. And then because it's an HOA, I was like, okay, it has to be a whole gated neighborhood that seems very lush and kind. And everyone's like, oh, we are very neighborly here. There's no American individualism that everyone thinks is the core of American culture. We don't do that stuff here. Soul definitely was I was just like, yes, I'm going to have, this Dominican woman as the main character. And she's going to have a wife because I can't imagine if I were in Soul's position, I could not afford a whole house by myself. So I was like, yeah, she's got to be married. They're going to need the dual income for this house. Logically, I was like building up like, okay, if I want this to happen, I need a bridge to connect. And so Alice came in next. And at that point was when I started to think, what does assimilation look like from a Black person's point of view and an Asian person's point of view? Like, what does it feel like to each of them? And like, there are some consistencies with regard to race. Assimilation is kind of demanding on both of their accounts, but it will often feel different in terms of like the rules of safety in this American white picket fence neighborhood. So Soul is like, yeah, we moved into this very safe neighborhood. I am not going for a walk because I am not about to be Trayvon Martin. Like, I'm not gonna, I hate that I had to use that as a verb, but like, she was just like, I'm not doing that here. Whereas Alice, who is Korean, she feels like, okay, I'm marginally safer. I can go for a walk and no one will ask me like who I think I am. But Soul is just like, I do not feel that safe. It's nice that I have a house, but I'm not walking outside unless it's to my backyard and back inside my home. So the rules of assimilation, the rules of safety start to get teased out between like this two couples. And that was where I started to really build out the story. Cause I started to think, what does it feel like if you and your wife or you and your best friend, like you assume that this other person who has a similar background, not exact background, because they are still two different races, similar background in that they are people of color. But even then, there will be differences that make you feel alone. Even then, you have to make concessions. Even then, you have to make some sort of compromise. And what does compromise and assimilation have in common in that sort of way?
There was definitely a lot there, especially when it came down to also the fact that Alice was still gainfully employed.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I mean, and it was a complete sham as to why Sol was accused of plagiarism. But she knew very much that the odds were stacked up against her
Right.
for numerous reasons,
Right.
and it really just drew a perfect kind of picture as to why she would be isolated. And the neighborhood is super, super creepy
Yep.
as well. How did the population of the neighborhood come into play? There's some characters I want to just ask something very specific about, but I don't want to say anything because, again, it would
Yep.
spoil it. And I just did so many double takes when like one particular character kept coming up, and it was wild and I loved it so much. But in general, how did the population of Mainless Grove fill itself in?
So I've been to a gated neighborhood exactly once in my life. I was in grad school and I think it was around Christmas or something. One of my classmates was like, "Oh, everyone should come over. We'll have like a whole dinner together." And so we decided carpool. One of my classmates comes to pick me up. We drive over there. And the first thing I noticed, like, because I didn't know where she lived, I never knew about like gated neighborhoods or anything. So the first thing I noticed is like it felt like a checkpoint where we drive up and there's a security guard and like we have to wait in the car because the security guard is like, all right, where are you headed to? And I'm just like, are we not just driving to someone's house? What's going on here? And they like, talk a little bit. It's like, all right, you can go through. And I was just like, what just happened? I was very much concerned. I was just like, am I being driven to a second location? Am I completely in the wrong about what's happening here? Am I getting kidnapped in a very elaborate way? But no, we drive up to this house and every single house looks so identical that I was like, how do you know this is the house? What about this house spells anything about like, oh, this is my house. Like, yeah, we know that this girl says it's her house. How do you know? If you were out for a walk and let's say you're out for a walk blindfolded and you spin around 3 times and you take your, like, how can you figure out like, oh yeah, I know exactly where I am. I know how to get to my house. It was a very surreal situation in which I learned kind of firsthand what a gated neighborhood looks like. And it's a lot of, everything needs to look the same because we were trying to keep property values high. But if you're making everything look the same, then you are losing something individualistic of like you're losing something of yourself to become part of this greater whole. And you can kind of go back and forth and like, is this worth it? Yeah, we gain security, but like if I'm not even allowed to paint my house a fun color, then what was the point of me sinking so much money into the house? Am I paying for the security or am I paying for a home? And then the characters themselves kind of started building up from a lot of different characters I've met in my life where I feel like I'm saying something very reasonable to, this white pregnant lady. And I'm like, yeah, like I don't have a good view of missionaries because of like my own experiences with them. And then you're like, oh, well, I did a whole round of missionary work in this other country. Let me show you my pictures. And I'm like, I don't want to see a picture of you being a white savior. Did you hear what I just said? And then I think I know what character you were specifically talking about. That one I crafted the situation around him fully as a joke. And when I say as a joke, it's because so comedy and horror are like two sides of the same coin. It has to do with tension and timing. And for this
100%.
and for this character, I was like, I think it's funny when people are like, oh, this group of people all look the same. But on the other side, what if you kept coming up to the same person and he looks slightly different every single time? Is that not creepy? Everyone else is going about their business. It's like that one episode from The Office when Dwight sees Asian Jim and like everyone else is pretending like, oh yeah, that's always been Jim. And Asian Jim is like, yeah, like good on you for not seeing race. That's a very funny situation. But if you really tune it up, it can get so creepy and horrifying. And it's just gaslighting essentially.
It's wonderful. And 100% again, as I said, about horror and comedy being almost like kindred spirits. And I know I've said this on the podcast numerous times, but just because I got into horror because of my film theory professor who taught 2 different film theory classes. One was horror and the other was comedy. And I took the horror one, but he did kind of explain at one point, people were like, well, I don't understand. Why do you switch it? And he's like, well, first of all, not everybody can handle horror.
Yeah.
It's not as easy a genre for people for different reasons, but also it shares qualities because, yes, as you were saying, it is timing and there is a bit of uncomfortableness that comes with both. And there is a visceral reaction to certain things that are going to happen. Like you hide your eyes when you think that there is going to be a jump scare, or when you think that a killer or some sort of entity is going to be revealed. And when you see that joke coming a mile away, you also often do that. You're also often clenching your fists, covering your face, and the release is very different. But sometimes it's not, because sometimes
right,
people
yeah.
get pictures mixed up and they just start
Yeah.
laughing. And I thought it was so lovely. And there are some lines later in the book that I was just laughing out loud at because it was so beautifully done. I suppose my next question would be, what drew you to the horror genre?
So first, I got into horror as sort of as a way to fill my time. I was in college and I was pre-med in college, but I had shifted, like I had done all of like the major sciences early on. And so I had an entire semester where I was just like, I'll just take a couple of joke courses, just to fill up credits, but I'm also bored. So I'll just start watching horror movies. And it took me a very long time to build up a tolerance for, because I was a weenie going into it. I was like, I'll just like slowly get into horror. But I slowly grew to have an appreciation for not just, the jump scares or, the gore, but the overall themes and the story that people are trying to weave into horror. Like I had recently watched I Saw the TV Glow, and I've seen that movie 3 times at this point. But the first time I watched it, I was bawling. I was distraught. And I think I grew to appreciate the way people are like having entire stories, like heart-wrenching stories crafted through horror.
The relationship between Sol and her dad,
Mm.
actually, if you don't mind coming back to that really
Yeah, of
quickly,
course.
that was really interesting because they have a relationship sort of built on some trauma,
Hmm.
and it's very, very complicated.
Yeah,
And it adds another layer to what Sol is going through
for
because
sure.
it's like you have this tough relationship with your parent and you have
Hmm.
like this sense of duty and also affection, but at the same time there's trauma back there behind
Yeah.
there. Was that always part of her story?
That definitely was always part of the story. When it comes to adult horror, I very rarely see the parents of the adult involved in the story. Like, very rarely. I think the last horror novel I'd read was Cuckoo by Gretchen Felker Martin. And it starts off with all the kids being like all of the characters being kids. So you do see a glimpses of them being adults. But then like when it shifts to them being adults, I almost never heard anything about the parents. So I feel like in horror, there is sort of a lack of storytelling about like how involved in your life are your parents now that you're an adult, now that you are like on equal footing with your parents. What is that like? And for Sol specifically, I knew that because she comes from a very traumatized background, that her dad was only going to exacerbate it. But at the same time, she is not willing to let it go in any meaningful way. Not to say that she's not trying to move beyond the trauma, but she's not letting anyone try to like, sweep it under the rug. Like, oh, but you came out like really well. She's like, actually, I came out super fucked up. We should talk about that now. And so there's just this element of like, she has this connection with her dad. It is not a healthy connection, but it is part of who she is. And she will be damned if you try to tell her otherwise.
Thank you so much. Check this book out. It comes out, I believe, September, correct?
Yeah, September 3rd.
By the time this podcast airs, the book will be on your shelves. Check it out. Go to the library in your suburban town, in your urban town, in your rural town. Go to your favorite independent bookstore, or if you have a Barnes and Noble nearby, do that too. Bookstores are great. I will take them how I can get them. And check out We Came to Welcome You. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.